April 15th, 1912. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, a ship that was never meant to fail is running out of time. Water is already pouring through the lower decks, spreading through corridors never designed to become escape routes. Carpets are soaked, lights still glow, music still plays. And yet, for many people on board, the truth has already settled in quietly. They are not going to survive this night. The only question left is how they will die. For over a century, popular memory has softened what happened next. Films and photographs have taught us to imagine calm final moments, people floating peacefully, holding onto doors, slowly fading into the darkness. That image is comforting. It is also deeply misleading. The reality was far more brutal. Almost everyone who died on the Titanic suffered first. Not for seconds, but for minutes. In some cases, for much longer. Their deaths were not poetic, not quiet, and not inevitable in the way we often assume. Many were the result of fear, confusion, exhaustion, and human decisions made under pressure. Decisions that turned a survivable disaster into a mass grave. This was not simply a ship sinking. It was a system failing in layers. A luxury vessel, hailed as the pinnacle of modern engineering, had convinced its passengers and its own leadership that danger was no longer something to be taken seriously. That belief shaped how people reacted when the warning signs appeared. It shaped how quickly they moved. It shaped who reached safety and who never had a chance. As water rose and time collapsed, thousands of individual stories began unfolding at once. Some people hesitated, trusting the ship more than their instincts. Others followed orders they did not fully understand. Many never even heard a warning at all. Below the surface, in the darkening heart of the vessel, entire families were already trapped long before panic reached the upper decks. What followed was not a single kind of death, but many layered, overlapping, and shaped by class, location, language, and simple proximity to an exit. To understand what truly happened on the Titanic, we must move past the myth of a peaceful ending. We must look directly at the final experiences of the people who were there, not as symbols, but as human beings, facing cold, darkness, and the consequences of a system that failed them when it mattered most. This is not the story of how the Titanic sank. It is the story of how people died. Long before the Titanic struck ice, the conditions for disaster were already in place. The early 20th century was an age of confidence bordering on arrogance. Industrial progress had reshaped cities, factories, and transportation. Each new invention reinforced the belief that nature could be measured, controlled, and ultimately overcome. The Titanic was born directly from that mindset. She was not just a ship, she was a statement. Built in Belfast by Harland and Wolff for the White Star Line, the Titanic was designed to embody modern certainty. Size was safety. Technology was protection. Redundancy was reassurance. The ship's watertight compartments were presented as proof that sinking was no longer a realistic concern, even though those compartments did not extend high enough to prevent flooding once multiple sections were breached. The idea of an unsinkable ship did not come from a single boastful sentence. It emerged from a culture that treated worst-case scenarios as theoretical rather than real. Safety regulations were written around assumptions of limited damage, not cascading failure. Lifeboat requirements were based on tonnage, not on the number of human beings aboard. As a result, the Titanic carried 20 lifeboats more than legally required, yet nowhere near enough to save everyone. Warnings existed. Engineers and designers understood that the ship's survivability depended on precise conditions. Thomas Andrews, one of the men most familiar with the Titanic's structure, had privately expressed concerns about how vulnerable such large vessels could be if multiple compartments flooded at once. These were not dramatic prophecies. They were quiet, technical realities. But they did not fit the narrative that surrounded the ship. Public messaging emphasized confidence over caution. Executives spoke of invincibility. Passengers boarded with the reassurance that even serious damage would amount to little more than inconvenience. This confidence filtered downward, shaping how the crew interpreted risk and how passengers understood their own vulnerability. The absence of urgency was not accidental. It was engineered. By the time the Titanic left Southampton in April of 1912, she carried more than 2,000 people, crew and passengers combined, all moving through a system designed around optimism rather than contingency. Emergency alarms were minimal. Evacuation procedures were theoretical. Few passengers had been instructed on where to go in a real crisis, and fewer still imagined they would ever need to find out. This mattered later, when time became the one resource no one had enough of. When the ship finally encountered danger, it was not entering unknown territory. It was encountering a scenario that had been dismissed as unlikely, and therefore never fully prepared for. The iceberg did not expose a single flaw. It revealed a chain of decisions, each reasonable in isolation, that together left no margin for error. The tragedy of the Titanic did not begin with ice tearing into steel. It began with certainty replacing caution, and confidence standing in for preparedness. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, the collision did not feel like a disaster. There was no explosion. No violent jolt that threw passengers from their feet. For many on board, especially those in first and second class, the impact was barely noticeable. A faint shudder, a subtle vibration, the sound of ice scraping along steel. Some people slept through it, others paused briefly, then returned to their conversations. This quietness was deceptive, and it proved fatal. Because the ship did not react like a vessel in immediate danger, most passengers assumed there was none. Crew members themselves initially believed the damage was manageable. After all, this was the Titanic, a ship designed to survive incidents far worse than a minor collision in calm seas. That assumption shaped everything that followed. As officers inspected the lower compartments, water was already rushing in faster than expected. The iceberg had not torn open a single section of the hull. It had breached multiple compartments along the starboard side. The Titanic was designed to stay afloat, with up to 4 compartments flooded. That night, at least 5 were compromised. The math was unforgiving. Yet above deck, reassurance continued. Passengers were told to put on lifebelts as a precaution. Many resisted. Lifebelts were uncomfortable. They ruined expensive clothing. More importantly, they implied danger, and danger was something most people had been conditioned not to believe in. The ship was brightly lit. The decks felt solid beneath their feet. Lifeboats looked small and fragile compared to the enormous vessel that had carried them across the Atlantic. For some, stepping into a lifeboat felt riskier than staying exactly where they were. This hesitation had consequences. Lifeboats were prepared and lowered slowly, carefully, and often with far fewer people than they could safely hold. In several cases, boats designed for 40 passengers left the ship carrying fewer than half that number. There was no sense of urgency pushing people forward. Instead, there was politeness, confusion, and trust in authority. Time slipped away quietly. Below deck, however, the situation was already deteriorating. Water climbed stairwells and spilled into corridors that had never been meant to flood. Crew members began moving through the ship, knocking on doors, urging people upward. But there was no general alarm system, no single moment when the entire ship was told, unmistakably, that survival now depended on speed. Language barriers compounded the problem. Many third-class passengers were immigrants who spoke little or no English. Instructions were shouted, repeated, misunderstood, or not understood at all. Some families hesitated, waiting for clearer guidance that never came. By the time panic began to spread, the advantage of calm had already been lost. What made this moment so deadly was not chaos, but its absence. The early stages of the sinking were defined by order, courtesy, and disbelief. People followed routines that no longer applied to the situation unfolding beneath them. They trusted systems that were already failing. The Titanic was sinking, but it was sinking politely. And in that dangerous calm, hundreds of people unknowingly gave up their only real chance to escape. For many passengers, the Titanic was already killing people long before the deck tilted or the lights went out. Deep inside the ship, water did not arrive slowly. It came with force. Corridors designed for dry passage became narrow channels, filling from the floor upward. Doors that had once separated sleeping quarters from machinery now failed under pressure, allowing freezing seawater to surge inward without warning. Third-class passengers were hit first and hardest. Their cabins were located low in the ship, close to the bow, where the iceberg had done its worst damage. Many were asleep when the collision occurred. Minutes later, they woke to water rushing across the floor, soaking bedding, clothing, and personal belongings in seconds. In some compartments, the water reached knee height almost immediately. The Titanic was enormous, and navigating it was difficult even in daylight, even without panic. For those below deck, escape routes were confusing, indirect, and poorly marked. Staircases did not lead straight upward. Passageways twisted and ended abruptly. What should have been obvious paths turned into dead ends. There were no loud alarms, no shipwide announcement telling people exactly what to do. Instead, stewards moved through the corridors, shouting warnings, knocking on doors, urging passengers upward as fast as possible. Some people understood. Others did not. Many spoke little English. Some hesitated, unsure whether this was a drill, a precaution, or a real emergency. Every hesitation mattered. As water continued to rise, movement became harder. The pressure of incoming seawater could knock people off their feet. Furniture floated free and slammed into walls and bodies. Luggage became obstacles. In the darkening corridors, people collided with one another, fell, and struggled to get back up. Exhaustion set in quickly. Fighting against moving water drained strength in minutes. Some people were trapped inside their cabins as doors became impossible to open against the pressure. Others made it into hallways only to be forced back by the current. For many, the effort of escape consumed all available energy long before they reached the upper decks. Drowning did not come gently. Cold water burned the lungs. Panic accelerated breathing. Some lost consciousness quickly. Others fought longer, aware of what was happening as the water closed in around them. In the lowest parts of the ship, survival was not a matter of courage or determination. It was a matter of location, timing, and pure luck. Even those who reached higher decks were not safe. Water spread vertically through stairwells and ventilation shafts, cutting off routes that had seemed viable only moments earlier. Families were separated in the confusion. Parents lost sight of children. People searched for exits that no longer existed. One survivor later recalled rushing back to his cabin to collect belongings, only to be nearly overwhelmed by the force of the water entering the room. He escaped with seconds to spare. Many others never had that chance. The phrase, "women and children first," carried little meaning below deck. There were no orderly lines, no officers directing movement, only darkness, noise, and the rising certainty that the ship itself had become a trap. For hundreds of people, the Titanic did not end in the open sea. It ended in tight corridors, locked doors, and water that rose faster than human beings could run. While passengers struggled to escape, another group of people moved in the opposite direction. Deep below deck, in spaces already filling with water, crew members continued to work long after survival was no longer possible for them. These were not moments of confusion or panic. They were deliberate choices made with full awareness of the consequences. In the boiler rooms and engine spaces, engineers and firemen fought to keep the Titanic functioning. As long as electricity remained, the ship had light. As long as pumps ran, flooding could be slowed, even if only temporarily. And as long as those systems stayed active, passengers above had more time to reach the lifeboats. That time was bought with human lives. Water rose rapidly in the lowest levels of the ship. Temperatures dropped. Steam hissed through damaged pipe. Yet the engineers remained at their posts, opening and closing valves, managing pressure, and attempting to contain the flooding as long as the machinery allowed. Some watertight doors were even reopened to bring additional pumps online, fully aware that this meant water would spread faster. There was no escape route for them. Above them, lifeboats were being lowered. Below them, compartments were disappearing one by one. The engineers understood exactly what that meant. Still, they stayed. Every minute they kept the lights on reduced panic on the decks. Every minute delayed the ship's final plunge increased the odds that someone else might survive. Nearby, in the mailroom on G-deck, 5 postal clerks faced a similar reality. The Titanic was officially a Royal Mail ship, carrying thousands of letters and packages across the Atlantic. When water began pouring into the mail compartments, the clerks did not flee. They attempted to haul heavy bags of mail upward, fighting rising water and collapsing conditions to preserve their duty. None of them survived. These men were not acting under direct orders. They were responding to an internal sense of responsibility, shaped by training, professionalism, and a belief that their work still mattered, even as the ship around them was dying. Their deaths were not dramatic. There were no witnesses, no final speeches. They were swallowed by water in the dark, unseen by the passengers, whose lives they were extending by minutes at a time. Above deck, the Titanic still appeared functional. Lights glowed, music played. Order persisted longer than it otherwise would have. That illusion of stability, the very thing that caused some passengers to hesitate, was maintained by people who already knew they would not be leaving the ship. All 35 engineers on board died that night. Many other crew members remained at their stations until escape was no longer possible. Their survival was never part of the equation. The Titanic did not stay alive by accident. It stayed alive because some people chose to die where they stood. By around 1:30 a.m., the Titanic was no longer merely sinking. She was failing structurally. The bow had dipped deep beneath the surface, pulling the rest of the ship downward with increasing force. Decks that had once been level began to slope sharply forward. Walking became difficult, standing still became dangerous. People slid across polished floors, collided with railings, or were thrown off balance by the growing angle of the ship. Gravity had taken control. As the tilt increased, passengers who had waited too long were forced into sudden decisions. Some clung to railings. Others jumped, believing the water below was safer than the steel beneath their feet. There was no longer a clear difference between the ship and the sea. Both were becoming equally lethal. The final lifeboat left the Titanic at around 2 a.m. More than 1,000 people were still on board. When the lights finally went out, darkness fell instantly across the decks. The sudden absence of electricity erased the last illusion of control. Panic spread as people lost sight of one another. In the blackness, it became impossible to judge distance, height, or direction. Moments later, the ship began to tear itself apart. Under immense stress, the Titanic's structure could no longer support its own weight. The bow, heavy with water, pulled downward while the stern rose unnaturally into the air. Steel plates bent. Rivets failed. With a deep, violent sound, the ship split in two. Anyone still inside the vessel, at that moment, faced almost certain death. Some were crushed by collapsing bulkheads. Others were thrown violently through corridors as the ship broke apart. Loose objects, furniture, machinery, railings, even entire sections of the ship's interior were ripped free and hurled into the water. For those nearby, the impact of falling debris could be fatal, or leave them injured and helpless in the sea. The break itself created chaos in the surrounding water. As massive sections of the ship sank, they displaced enormous volumes of seawater, creating powerful currents. People near the hull were dragged downward by the motion. Strong swimmers might have escaped if they were far enough away. Many were not. There is evidence that some passengers survived the break only to be flung into the freezing ocean, injured, disoriented, and exhausted before the real ordeal even began. A broken arm, a head wound, or even heavy bruising could mean death minutes later, once hypothermia took hold. The Titanic did not simply sink beneath the wave. She destroyed the space around her as she went. What remained was not a shipwreck scene frozen in time, but a violent transition from structure to chaos, from light to darkness, from order to complete exposure. For those still alive at the surface, the disaster had entered its final phase. And it would be far colder than anything they had yet faced. For those who ended up in the sea, survival was measured in minutes. The North Atlantic that night was not merely cold, it was lethal. The water temperature hovered around -2 degrees Celsius, just below freezing. At that temperature, the human body begins to fail, almost immediately. The moment a person hit the water, the shock alone could kill them. Cold shock triggered an involuntary gasp. Many people inhaled water instantly, losing the ability to control their breathing. Heart rates spiked. Blood pressure surged. For some, especially the elderly or those already injured, cardiac arrest followed within moments. Those who did not die immediately faced a different countdown. The cold attacked the body from the outside inward. Muscles stiffened. Fingers lost dexterity within seconds. Arms became heavy, unresponsive. Swimming, even for strong swimmers, quickly became impossible. Life jackets could keep a person afloat, but they could not keep them warm. Hypothermia did not arrive gently. As core temperature dropped, confusion set in. Movement slowed. Speech became slurred, then impossible. Many victims experienced a false sensation of warmth as their bodies shut down, a cruel biological illusion that often preceded unconsciousness. Around them, the sounds of suffering filled the darkness. People cried out for help. Others screamed names into the night, hoping anyone could hear them. The water carried those sounds across the surface, amplifying them briefly before swallowing them altogether. Survivors later described the noise as unbearable, followed by an even worse silence when the cries finally stopped. That silence came quickly. Within roughly 15 to 30 minutes, most people in the water lost consciousness. Shortly after, they drowned. Not because they lacked the will to live, but because the human body cannot function in conditions like these for long. A small number of people managed to cling to debris. A handful stayed alive longer than anyone should have been able to, but these were exceptions measured against overwhelming odds. Rescue was not coming in time. Although distress flares had been fired and other ships had seen them, the distances involved were too great. The nearest vessel capable of responding would take hours to arrive. By then, almost everyone in the water would already be dead. The ocean did not rage that night. It did not need to. Still, silent, and unimaginably cold, the sea finished what steel and water had begun. The Titanic's final victims did not disappear beneath the waves all at once. They vanished one by one as their bodies surrendered to conditions no human being was meant to endure. When the Titanic finally vanished beneath the surface, the disaster did not end. It changed form. Floating in the darkness were hundreds of lifeboats and improvised rafts, many of them carrying far fewer people than they were designed to hold. Around them, the surface of the ocean was crowded with human beings, fighting to stay alive. For a brief window of time, rescue was still possible. That window closed quickly. Those inside the lifeboats could hear the people in the water. The cries carried clearly across the still sea, desperate, overlapping, and full of terror. Survivors would later say that it was impossible to forget the sound. It was not one voice, but hundreds, calling out at once. Then came the choice. Lifeboats were small, unstable, and heavily loaded with fear. The people inside knew that if too many swimmers reached them at once, the boat could capsize. In the open ocean, that would mean death for everyone aboard. Officers warned against turning back. Passengers argued. Some begged to row toward the cries, others refused. Most boats stayed where they were. This was not cruelty in the simple sense. It was panic, calculation, and self-preservation colliding in real time. The people in the lifeboats were cold, exhausted, and terrified. Many believed that approaching the swimmers would doom them all. They chose, consciously or not, to survive at the expense of others. Only one lifeboat eventually returned. By the time it did, the ocean had already gone quiet. The cries had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness broken only by the sound of water against wood. Those who were pulled from the sea were barely alive. Most were already dead. Within roughly 40 minutes of the Titanic's final plunge, the surface of the North Atlantic had transformed from chaos into silence. The people who had filled it moments earlier were gone. For those in the boats, the silence was worse than the noise. They were left alone with the knowledge of what they had heard and what they had chosen not to do. There were no right answers in that moment, only consequences. Survival demanded decisions that would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. History often asks why the lifeboats did not return sooner. The harder question is whether anyone truly knows what they would have done in the same position. Floating in darkness, surrounded by death, fearing that one wrong move could end everything. The Titanic did not force everyone to die, but it forced the survivors to live with what they heard and what they could not save. When the final counts were made, the scale of the loss became clear. Approximately 1,500 people died on the Titanic. That figure alone is staggering, but the pattern behind it is even more revealing. Survival on that night was not random. It followed lines that had been drawn long before the iceberg was ever seen. Class mattered. First-class passengers had cabins close to the upper decks and lifeboats. They moved through wide corridors, spoke the language of the crew, and received information earlier. As a result, about 39% of first-class passengers died. In second class, that number rose sharply. Roughly 58% did not survive. Their accommodations were scattered across the ship, some close to safety, others dangerously low. Survival depended largely on where one happened to be when the situation escalated. For third-class passengers, the outcome was devastating. Approximately 76% died. Many were trapped deep in the ship, far from lifeboats, navigating confusing passageways while water rose around them. Language barriers delayed understanding. Physical barriers slowed escape. By the time many reached the upper decks, there was nowhere left to go. Gender mattered. The policy of women and children first saved lives, but it also sealed others' fates. Around 80% of male passengers died. Many stood aside as lifeboats were filled. Others waited for orders that never came. Some refused to leave their families behind. Whatever the reason, most men on board did not survive the night. Age mattered. Of the 109 children aboard the Titanic, 53 died. Entire families were lost together. The youngest victim was just 19 months old. The promise that children would be protected was not always enough to overcome distance, confusion, and time. Occupation mattered. More than 3/4 of the crew died. Engineers, firemen, stewards, and postal clerks remained at their posts as long as duty demanded. Captain Edward Smith himself was last seen still aboard the ship as it went down. Those responsible for keeping the Titanic running paid for that responsibility with their lives. These numbers expose a truth that is uncomfortable but undeniable. The Titanic was not an equal opportunity disaster. Survival correlated strongly with wealth, position, and access to information. The ship's design and procedures favored some lives over others, not by intention, but by structure. Had the lifeboats been filled to capacity, hundreds more could have survived. Had warnings been clearer, earlier, and understood by all, the numbers might have looked very different. Instead, empty seats drifted away on the ocean, while people froze and drowned within sight of rescue. Statistics often feel impersonal. In this case, they are the opposite. They strip away myth and leave only reality. They show us exactly who the system worked for and who it did not. The Titanic did not just sink a ship. It exposed how unevenly survival itself was distributed. In the aftermath of the sinking, the world searched for meaning in the wreckage. Newspapers debated blame. Inquiries dissected timelines and testimony. Engineers analyzed steel, rivets, and design flaws. Out of this scrutiny came reforms, more lifeboats, continuous radio watches, international safety regulations that still shape maritime travel today. But none of that mattered to the people who had already died. For them, the Titanic was not a lesson. It was an ending. More than 1,500 lives were lost, not because survival was impossible, but because preparation was incomplete and confidence replaced caution. The disaster was not inevitable. It was the result of decisions layered over time, decisions that assumed the worst would never happen until it did. The iceberg did not change course. The sea did not behave unusually. The laws of physics did exactly what they always do. What failed was human judgment. The Titanic was built during a moment in history when progress felt unstoppable. Technology promised safety. Scale promised strength. Luxury promised control. That belief blinded those in charge to the simple truth that nature does not negotiate, and systems fail most catastrophically when they are trusted too completely. Even today, the questions linger. What if the warnings had been taken seriously? What if the lifeboats had been filled? What if the ship had slowed, or altered course, or been designed with different assumptions? There are no answers that bring comfort, only reminders. The ocean floor still holds the remains of the Titanic, scattered and silent. Many of the people who died that night were never recovered. Their final moments exist only in fragment survivor accounts, frozen data, and the spaces between what we know and what we can never fully reconstruct. The story of the Titanic endures not because a ship sank, but because it revealed something enduring about us. Our tendency to trust systems until they fail. Our willingness to believe reassurances when they are most dangerous, and the human cost of learning lessons only after it is too late. The Titanic did not change the world overnight. It warned it. Whether we continue to listen is a question that remains unanswered.